So, just to be respectful of everyone's time, this is Brian Vicente. I'm going to go ahead and be our sort of MC today. I'm going to speak about a few of the grab bag states, but I'm so honored to have the folks that are really playing a giant role in some of the biggest ballot initiatives on cannabis and psychedelics today. There's the speakers in front of you. I'll make a couple kind of quick comments before I jump into the real content here. I did want to acknowledge, the issue of cannabis and psychedelics policy is so important. So many of the people, our panelists, as well as people tuning in, are interested in this for social justice reasons, for economic reasons. But I did want to give a nod to, we had a number of veteran groups reach out and say that they were really happy that we were hosting this measure, that we were promoting these ballot measures on cannabis and psychedelics. And I did want to give a shout out to our friends at the American Legion, Blue Sky, Lakeside, Post 426, Montana, for their kind words in the run up here. The other quick announcement I'll make, and again, I'm Brian Vicente. I'm with the law firm Vicente Cedarburg. We do cannabis and psychedelics all across the country all the time. Is about a week ago, this is a quick story, Willie Nelson reached out to our team and he said, hey, I want you guys to help elevate cannabis policy in the presidential race. And can you help us organize an event? And so we are actually organizing that event. It's going to happen at 5 o'clock Mountain today. And it's basically Willie and a bunch of his celebrity buddies, as well as the governor of Colorado and a bunch of Congress people from across the country, including Barbara Lee and Earl Blumenauer, these amazing people that are going to tune in and talk about why cannabis matters at the federal level. I did want to be clear that they will almost definitely be promoting Kamala Harris. For the purposes of this webinar today, we are not taking any stance on the presidential. As long as you care about cannabis policy, psychedelic policy, you're welcome here. And whether you support Trump or Kamala or even a third party, I think there's one thing Americans can agree on, and that is Willie Nelson is amazing. So if you want to tune in just a few hours to hear what Willie has to say about cannabis policy and with all these other star-studded speakers, I think we threw that in the chat, and maybe we can send it out to folks afterwards as well. But just something to check out. That's later today, and obviously this is election season, so things are jamming. Here's our prestigious list of speakers. All these folks are going to dive into their subject matter expert areas, whether that's cannabis or psychedelics. I did want to just tip my hat. Krista Eggers' picture is up here. She's not going to participate today. She was that last minute, so we had to sort of pull her out. But if you want to know what heroism looks like in human form, you should Google Krista Eggers and the battle that she's been through to try to get her son, who has a medical condition and seizures, access to legal medical cannabis in Nebraska. That's one of the ballot measures we're going to talk about today. The level of government malfeasance and personal attacks she's faced in that running that campaign. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen anything like it. So if you can shoot her a note of support, if you can donate to that campaign, if you ever see her and want to high five her, we're just so proud of the work going on in Nebraska. Unfortunately, my colleague, Matt from the Marijuana Policy Project, which is one of the co-sponsors of this event today, and just is a nonprofit that's been doing incredible cannabis work for 30 years, 25 years, we'll be covering Nebraska in addition to the Dakotas. So I'm going to dive into a couple quick states, and then I'm going to turn it over to our sort of prestigious speakers. So I think we can advance the slide one here, and I think I'm going to hit on Arkansas real quick here. Here's the overview, right? I'm going to very quickly do Arkansas and Oregon and their cannabis measures, and then we'll talk about, we have the head of government relations for Trulieve to talk about the Florida campaign. We have Matt Schweik, the head of state ballot campaigns for Marijuana Policy Project, who's played a big role in North Dakota, South Dakota, and he'll speak about Nebraska as well. And then we're going to dive into the psychedelic statewide measure that is on in Massachusetts, where my colleague Barina will be speaking about that measure. So next slide, please. Arkansas and Oregon, these are kind of our grab bags. This is just sad news, honestly. Arkansas, as many people know, has had medical marijuana statewide for years. Advocates there tried to expand that law and add home cultivation, a broader set of medical conditions or just open medical conditions, out-of-state medical cards. And unfortunately, and this is a trend, we talked about the headache the Nebraska campaign's facing. We can look back at South Dakota and some of the issues there, but we frequently have conservative lawmakers, conservative AGs, conservative Supreme Courts that don't like cannabis and are doing everything they can to toss these measures out, these statewide measures. And unfortunately, that's what happened to Arkansas 2 days ago. After getting on the ballot, getting all the signatures, they were tossed off the ballot, or told that the vote would be invalidated by the state Supreme Court. And that was for a pretty silly reason in my mind. Apparently, the Attorney General of Arkansas said, hey, you should call your ballot measure the Arkansas Medical Marijuana Amendment of 2024. Well, the Supreme Court decided that that was misleading. Because there was a provision in that measure that said if the feds legalize cannabis for any purpose, then any person in Arkansas 21 and over can have an ounce of cannabis without criminal penalties. And they thought that they were trying to shoehorn legalization into a medical ballot measure. So it's really heartbreaking. I'm not sure exactly what the Arkansas team is going to do, but that will no longer be voted on this year. So next slide. It'll be voted on, it just won't be counted, sadly. This is, I've been doing this for 20 years. This is one of the most bizarre and hilarious ballot issues I've seen. There's a serious measure on the ballot statewide in Oregon, and that would allow for labor peace agreements, mandate that they be signed, basically mandating that all licensed Oregon cannabis businesses allow unionization to occur, or unionization activities to occur. It doesn't mean they're mandating unionization, but basically saying these business owners would agree not to fight unionization. Interesting, there's a couple states that already have this. I think it's in New Jersey. What other states? New Jersey, New York, and California. But what I find just fascinating about this is when you vote, every voter in the state gets we call it a blue book, but a informational pamphlet on what is in the ballot. And this is literally in front of you is the argument in favor, which I thought was very well written. And then if you sort of pull out the highlighted words, it's actually a like Rickroll going on by the actual proponents that wrote this measure. So I just give them credit. This is super creative. It gets people talking, and I guess it's on message. So we'll see what happens. I do predict this will probably pass because it's a pretty liberal state. And I just thought that was too fun not to share. So I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague and friend, Lauren. Lauren is the head of government relations for TrueLeave. It's a wonderful and giant MSO, and they have a very large presence across the country as well as in Florida, and they have invested tremendously in this effort, and I really commend them for doing so. So Lauren, can I give you the mic?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Brian, and thanks for having me. As many of you may know, Amendment 3 is the adult use legalization issue that already is on the ballot in Florida. And in very basic terms, I'm going to talk through the process, how we got to where we were today, or where we are today. But the amendment is very straightforward and simple in terms of its language, which is a requirement in Florida. So the language basically says adults 21 and over can have up to 3 ounces of cannabis in their possession and can purchase through existing MMTCs in the state. In Florida, they're called medical marijuana treatment centers, dispensaries are. And that the legislature is empowered to not only add more licenses in the state, should they so choose, but also to implement time, place, and manner regulations surrounding adult use. So whereas in some other states, we've seen ballot measures that kind of really list out how the program can be run, it's not something that we could do in Florida, but we absolutely know that when we get this across the finish line on November 5th, that the legislature will get to work on the actual implementation of adult use for Florida. Quick backstory on the initiative process in Florida. It's very complex. Florida makes it difficult to get something on the ballot. And so we started this process a couple of years ago and had our language initially approved by the Division of Elections, and started signature gathering. We gathered more than 1 million signatures to meet the required threshold. And then we moved on to Supreme Court review, which is a requirement in the state of Florida. So you grab your signatures, and then the Supreme Court tells you yes or no, will you be on the ballot? And then you really go to the races and start running a campaign. Interestingly, the Supreme Court had until April 1st of 2024 to rule, and they waited until April 1st of 2024 to rule. So we had lots of pins and needles for a lot of time, but made it on the ballot. And now we are marching, and the campaign is running hard because we have a 60% threshold to pass. So another thing that Florida makes tricky for some of these issues is the threshold. Excuse me. As many of you may know, a few states have gotten across that 60% threshold, and we are trending in the right direction. There are many polls run even by the opposition that show us solidly in the 60s. So we're continuing to monitor that very closely. Voter turnout is very important this year. As we all know, a presidential election year tends to bring more voters to the polls. And we felt that in Florida, this is the time. There's a wildly successful medical program with more patients than any other state across the country, and the timing was right. The political environment is challenging, as you can imagine, in a very red state. As we've seen over time, I think many can agree, this isn't completely a partisan issue anymore. We're getting closer to the middle, but we still do have, left-leaning tend to support this issue, our issue of cannabis, more than the right does. But I think we're starting to finally, after everybody's efforts on this call and everybody out there in the audience, we're getting closer to middle ground. Veteran access is a huge deal in Florida, and so I saw somebody in the comments. We know that this is going to be monumental for many people's lives in Florida. We have had some really interesting bipartisan support from the Democratic Party of Florida to former President Trump, which has been a very interesting dynamic. I think anybody who's on the internet knows where the governor of the state sits on this, and that's okay. Campaigns are built to weather the storm, if you will, and opposition is expected in this industry, but in any given campaign. Early voting has commenced in Florida, so whereas obviously we don't see numbers until the 5th, we know that folks are out there, they're voting. The campaign is airing advertisements on social media and throughout TV networks across the state, and the ground game is strong. We're out deploying more yard signs today and doing all the things to make sure that people are educated and understand what this does and how big of an achievement for increased access it can be for all adults 21 plus in the state of Florida. So I'll keep it kind of high level there, because as you might imagine, I can talk on this subject for hours and hours. But Brian, I'll turn it back to you and look forward to having some dialogue at the end.
Thanks, Lauren. And I'm going to just hit you with a question or two right now. This is so important. I mean, 23 million people in the state of Florida. How, I guess two things. But first off, I've been thinking about you guys, and obviously you truly have had such a large presence with stores and so forth, as do other companies in Florida. These storms that have been going on, is that going to impact voter turnout? Has the state reacted to that? How are you feeling?
Yeah, the state is actually, obviously hurricanes are unfortunately a very normal occurrence in the state. We as a company are very prepared to ensure that first and foremost, our patients have access to their medicine and that our employees and patients are safe during a storm, closing stores and reopening as necessary. And the state has added additional precinct locations, especially in this go round in the, the Tampa area, where a lot of folks were hit really hard during this last storm. So state has responded. We're seeing people are out there early voting, and the same, Brian, goes for mail-in ballots. A lot of folks were in that period to receive their mail-in ballot when they were not able to be home, and they might not have a home to come back to. So there's a process for re-requesting those ballots as well.
Gotcha. Well, it's great that the state sort of reacted to that and jumped on it. I'm also curious, and I don't know if Lauren or Matt have thoughts on this. I mean, this would be the first legalization win in the South in history. I mean, thoughts on how that may affect other states in the region?
I'll give my initial thought, and then Matt, feel free to jump in. It's huge, right? Not just because of it's the first in the South, but it's Florida, 23 million people. I think that there's two schools of thought on it. That some surrounding states that don't even have medical programs yet say, "Whoa, this is what's going to happen to our state." And I think everybody on this call knows it is not inevitable that adult use comes to a state who has a medical program. I think it absolutely opens up the conversation And as we've all seen, I'm out here in Colorado, the sky doesn't fall when legalization happens. And so for other surrounding states, nearby Florida, I think that over time that will be of benefit for them to see, oh, this is a huge state, not just from tax revenue, but an expanded regulated access, but it's going to be okay. And we have a neighbor who's doing this, and everything is just fine. So I think it's a net positive in the end.
Gotcha. Matt, anything to add there, my friend?
I think it's very helpful for efforts to pass these laws in other states, both medical and recreational. We know over time that the argument that people are just going to cross the border, go to another state, purchase cannabis, and leave behind, to the benefit of that state, all the jobs, all the revenue, the investment activity. That's an effective argument. A part of the reason we haven't seen as much progress in the South is, of course, different voter attitudes, but also most states in the South do not have an initiative process. So Florida does, Mississippi does, Arkansas does. Otherwise, it's mostly out west and in the Northeast. So I do think it's going to be very helpful. And MPP has had Louisiana in particular as a priority state. But we're going to have to work through state legislatures in many of these states, and having such a prominent and large population state in the South having passed this policy is only going to help.
Thank you, Matt. No, I really appreciate that. And someone in the comments said, Ohio learned that the hard way. I think they're referring to people, I'm from Ohio originally, people driving from Ohio to Michigan and spending all their money promoting Michigan jobs and tax revenue, and then driving back to Ohio. So we may likely see something similar in the South if and when this passes. So let's turn things over. Matt, thanks for jumping in. I think we're going to have you jump on the Dakotas, an area you have deep experience in, and then Nebraska. So can I turn things to you, buddy?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian, for hosting and putting this together. My name is Matthew Schweik. I'm the executive director of the Marijuana Policy Project. I've been working on this issue for 10 years now. This is my 5th election cycle. I helped run the campaigns, ballot initiative campaigns in Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Utah, Montana, South Dakota. I've also been involved in other efforts that didn't quite make it across the finish line, like in Nebraska, North Dakota, and Idaho, and others. I'm speaking to you right now from Sioux Falls, where I've been for the last, many weeks. And I'll start with North Dakota, where there's Measure 5. This is an adult use legalization initiative, builds on the existing medical program. We tried to pass recreational in a very similar manner in 2022. We came up short. It was a very underfunded campaign, and running an underfunded campaign in a midterm election in a red state is always going to be very difficult. But and I want to be clear, I have not been working on this North Dakota campaign or running it. The people that deserve credit for that are the folks in North Dakota who are from the industry there, the medical industry. I think it's going to be a very tight race, a 50-50 race. And unfortunately, it's just been very hard to bring national resources to these smaller states where the markets aren't as big and there's therefore less interest. But I do believe that these polls, I think, might be undercounting the youth vote. And so I think it's a 50-50 race. And we're hopeful that the Measure 5 will pass, but it will be close. You can move to South Dakota. So South Dakota, we're running Measure 29, initiated Measure 29. The interesting thing about this initiative is that it does not include regulated sales. It doesn't include a tax rate. It's just legalization for the individual. That was not our choice. We would have preferred to write a broad, comprehensive policy like we've done in many other states. However, back in 2020, you might recall that we passed 2 initiatives at the same time. We passed recreational and medical at the same time, the first and only state, I believe, to do that. And Amendment A was the recreational law, and Measure 26 was the medical law. We then, after winning on Election Day in 2020, we had to fight battles on both fronts. On the medical program, we had to fight Governor Noem's attempts to delay implementation. Somehow, in a Republican supermajority-controlled legislature, we succeeded. We defeated her bill, HB 1100, and from then on, it's been mostly smooth sailing, getting the medical program up and running. There's over 10,000 patients here now. And the cool thing about the medical program here in South Dakota is it's really comprised of in-state people. And I think it's exciting to see people from the state getting to realize these economic activities, these opportunities, these entrepreneurial endeavors. So we want to build on that success. Going back to what happened in 2020, Amendment A was the recreational law, and Governor Noem used taxpayer dollars to fund a lawsuit against Amendment A, challenging it on single subject grounds. A single subject rule is there's a rule many states have that says your initiative can't address multiple areas of public policy. At that time, it was an untested rule that had been recently established. We thought that cannabis was a subject. Unfortunately, the South Dakota Supreme Court took a very literal, and I would argue extremist position, and issued a ruling based on a concept that I think should have stayed in a law school classroom somewhere, and said that because the initiative in one sentence mentioned medical marijuana and in another sentence mentioned hemp, that therefore it was multiple subjects, and they threw out the entire law despite the fact it was approved by 54% of South Dakota voters. We immediately went back to the ballot in 22, and I knew that was a risky endeavor because it was going to be hard to raise money. It was a midterm election in a red state, but I felt the injustice of the ruling in the Amendment A case was so egregious that it was important not just for cannabis policy, but for the initiative process itself, to give the people of South Dakota the opportunity to restore the law that was taken away from them. Unfortunately, we didn't have the resources to win. We were defeated in 2022. But we're back on the ballot again. Third time's the charm. The only state ever to vote on this twice in a row, let alone 3 times in a row. Our campaign again is very underfunded. Florida's raised 100 million, which I applaud them for. We haven't even raised 1 million. And while Florida's big, it doesn't have 100 times the population of South Dakota. But it is what it is. We knew it was always going to be hard to raise money. So this is really a grassroots campaign, very small team. Almost all of the fundraising has come from in-state. And as you can imagine, a medical cannabis industry that relies on 12,000 customers isn't exactly going to be printing money for political campaigns. But the good news is that we're in a position to win. That poll from May, I think, was a little bit on the pessimistic side. A poll just got released today showing that we're within the margin of error. I think, like North Dakota, it's going to be very close. It's going to come down to turnout. So we're focusing all our efforts on calling unlikely voters, people who vote sporadically, and impressing upon them the importance of showing up in this election. One thing we have working in our favor here is there is a pro-choice initiative on the ballot. And I say that's in our favor because I think it will help with turnout, especially among younger voters who are more likely to support reproductive rights. So it's going to be a toss-up. We're going to be grinding it out to the finish line, and hopefully the Dakotas can deliver good news. It is kind of funny to me that the 3 recreational campaigns this time are Florida's massive state, and then the 2 Dakotas. In the past, early on when I started in 2016, it was Maine, Massachusetts, Arizona, Nevada, California, and then Michigan, Utah. It was always a kind of interesting set. Here it's just Florida and the Dakotas. But when we think about the battle ahead for federal reform, we're going to need every Senate vote we can get. And one thing that's the same about Florida and South Dakota is they each have 2 United States senators. So I do think that these campaigns are not just important for the people who live in these states, but they're also important for Americans across the country because we need federal reform. And unless we have the votes we need in the Senate, we're not going to pass it. And by passing these types of laws in red states, we make it more achievable to win over Republican senators whom we will need in order to pass something meaningful at the federal level. I could talk like Lauren about Florida. I could talk about South Dakota forever, but I think we're ready to move on to Nebraska.
And I did want to say while you're flipping over there, Matt, what do Florida, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota have in common, and honestly, Nebraska, is they're all very conservative states, right? These are red states, and I think it just speaks to that this has become a nonpartisan issue. You have favorable polling in all these districts or in all these states. And, I think your point about, some people could say, well, there's a couple million people between North and South Dakota. That's great that they're going to have access to legal cannabis, but how's that affect the bigger question? And I think your point about, well, there are members of Congress that are going to come out of these states, and it does seem likely under the new president, whoever that may be, that cannabis will be a hot topic and most likely will move towards legalization. So getting those votes from the Dakotas, from the Floridas, Nebraskas that will hopefully vote, those Congress people will vote to support their constituents, is just such a big deal. So I'll please jump into Nebraska, Matt.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, in terms of low-hanging fruit for the cannabis reform movement, that was blue states with an initiative process. They're all done. We passed recreational in all of them. So now we're in tougher terrain. And I think when people look at the cannabis reform movement, there have been more defeats recently. If you look at it over the course of time, there were early on many defeats, only defeats, right? And then we get into 2012, 2014, and we start winning. And then we started mostly winning because we were pursuing the low-hanging fruit. And now we've passed legalization in all the blue initiative states. Now we're starting to lose a little more. But my point is that should be expected over the course of this movement. It's logical that we would pursue winnable campaigns first and then pivot to tougher races. So I think that's important context when you look at how things have gone at the ballot over the course of time. Nebraska, this is a state I've been involved in since 2020. We ran a heroic grassroots signature drive in 2020. We qualified medical marijuana for the ballot, and that was struck down again on a single subject ruling by the Nebraska Supreme Court. Quick aside, we're in an era where the initiative process is under attack, and it's not just because of marijuana, it's because of things like Medicaid expansion, minimum wage, paid family leave. What we've seen in this country is these red states where, due to gerrymandering and national mistakes, I would argue, we've seen the Democratic parties in some of these states like Idaho and South Dakota just become eradicated. But people's opinions have not changed as quickly as the political composition of their legislatures and their elected officers. And so while Idaho, for example, or Utah, deeply red, something like Medicaid expansion is such a public policy no-brainer that it passes at the ballot. And the reaction has been from conservatives and Republicans to try to restrict or undermine or even destroy the initiative process that exists in 24 different states across the country. And so we're a victim of that phenomenon. I mentioned the single subject rule for South Dakota. I've had 2 campaigns killed by single subject rulings that basically turned cannabis into multiple subjects. So sadly, that happened in Nebraska in 2020. We were thrown off the ballot. In South Dakota, at least they let us win first. 22, there was an effort to go back to the ballot. Couldn't raise the money. Nebraska is a difficult state to do signature drives in. It has a geographic distribution requirement that requires you to go to very rural parts of the state that are very, very conservative and try to collect signatures for medical cannabis. This time around, for 2024, the in-state group did this successfully, and I don't want to take any credit for their work. I was cheering them on, but they did this. Krista Eggers, who was going to join us, Brian mentioned at the beginning, one of the most inspirational advocates I've ever met. Her son has severe epilepsy, suffers constant seizures. She's a political advocate because it's for her family, not to mention people all across Nebraska. She has faced, I would call it persecution at the hands of the political establishment. They are saying that there were irregularities during the signature drive. And look, I've run many signature drives. When you're collecting tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of signatures with hundreds and hundreds of volunteers and paid circulators, the idea that every single thing would be done perfectly is ridiculous. Of course, if there's fraudulent signatures, you throw them out. If there's a notary who has an expired notary, you throw them out. but to attack the entire validity of an entire signature drive because of a few mistakes that were made is an egregious overreach of government interference in the initiative process. And Krista is being persecuted for trying to advocate for people. And it's frankly despicable what's being done in Nebraska. So you've got two initiatives, 437 and 438. They work together to establish a functional and effective medical marijuana program. Why are there two of them? Because of that single subject ruling in 2020. That's why Measure 29 here in South Dakota only legalizes for the individual. So we've been forced to adapt to these unjust court rulings that restrict the initiative process. They can try to get rid of us, but we find a way to write policies that can adhere to their unreasonable standards established in those rulings. So there's two initiatives, they work together. There is precedent for passing two at the same time. Montana, in 2020, we had to pass two initiatives, 118 and 190. One was for the policy, the other was just to set the age to 21. We had to do a whole second initiative just to make the age 21. So it's a similar model here, passing two. We need yes on 437, yes on 438, 5-ounce possession limit, fairly open-ended set of qualifying conditions. And Vicente has done an economic analysis, and that's where that bullet point comes from. We could see 93,000 patients across the state, 152 million in sales. A couple final things I'll say about Nebraska. It's one of two states that splits its electoral college votes. So every other state has an idiotic winner-take-all approach. Maine and Nebraska split their electoral college votes. They give 2 to the statewide winner, and they give 1 each for each congressional district. So there's been a lot of attention on Nebraska for that reason. It is possible that 1 congressional district in Nebraska and the northern part of Maine decide who the president is. I'll just again say this is an idiotic system for choosing our president. I can't help myself. The other thing that's interesting about Nebraska is it's got a competitive Senate race somehow for a deep red state. Deb Fischer is running against Dan Osborne. Osborne is running as an independent, and he is an ally to be for the cannabis reform movement in DC. If you're looking for a Senate race to support where it would be a dream win and it's actually achievable, that's Osborne in Nebraska. And supporting him, I think, can only help the medical effort as well, because everything he's going to be doing is going to be about driving turnout, and the majority of those voters he turns out are going to be on our side on medical cannabis. So I probably went over my allotted time, but Brian probably knew that when he asked me to talk about this many states.
No, Matt, and actually, if we could go back to the slide just real quick, really appreciate that, Matt. To me, this is just one of the most exciting campaigns, largely because, I mean, Nebraska is, I think, will be the 49th state to get medical marijuana. They have no medical marijuana whatsoever, right? It's there in Idaho. So it's like, man, it'd be a great way to fill out the map. And I did want to say that sort of second major bullet point, as Matt indicated, our firm did an economic analysis, which has been published and kind of caught a fair amount of media attention in Nebraska. We're actually looking at about $1 billion in economic impact for the state by the end of 2030. So it's 152 million in sales. But when you look at all the ancillary impact, when you look at taxes, when you look at job creation, it's really could be a pretty big deal for a relatively small state. So with that said, we're going to now take off our cannabis hat and put on our psychedelics hat. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Verena, who is a international expert on psychedelic policy. She's been very involved in Colorado, which has a robust psychedelic law for medical purposes. Our firm played a pretty big role in that. And now she's helping to tackle a similar law in Massachusetts. So I'm going to turn things over to Verena.
Thanks, Brian. Hey, everybody. First, I wanted to take a second to comment on why this psychedelics question is so important to us. A lot of you folks on the call probably already know this, but just to reiterate, we have a nationwide, really a global mental health crisis right now. We have very high rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, addiction, and we have a lot of treatments for them, but many of these treatments don't work for a lot of people, or they work for a short period of time and then they fail to work. And then we label these folks treatment resistant. I took a little side road during my legal career, and I was at Johns Hopkins on their psilocybin studies. And I saw firsthand how enormously powerful these medicines are, psilocybin in particular, but really all of the ones we're going to discuss today for various kind of mental health issues. And so we have a lot of people, including our veterans, that need new forms of help. And again, these psychedelic medicines have shown enormous promise, and we see that both in current research, and we see that historically, and we hear that anecdotally, and they're not across the board safe, right? It's not like you can give anyone psychedelics in any setting and come up with a good outcome. But used appropriately, these different psychedelic medicines have shown promise for a lot of different conditions, everything from anxiety to trauma to depression to otherwise treatment-resistant addictions. And when used properly, we see that these psychedelics are having profound healing effects that we can't get with our other existing treatments right now. And for folks who are suicidal because of their mental health problems, these are often literally life-saving medicines. And we hear that over and over again from veterans and from other folks who have tried other treatments and they haven't worked. So I just wanted to set that context for why this is important in Massachusetts and any other state where hopefully this ends up on the ballot. These medicines are, as you guys know, federally illegal. They're all controlled substances. So in some ways, we're in a situation very similar to the early days of cannabis, where we have voters in states slowly coming to realize the importance of having access to these medicines and starting to vote in a way that allows them to be available in different structures under state law while they're still legal under federal law. So right now, Oregon and Colorado are the two states that have passed statewide measures. And if you are familiar with either of those, the Massachusetts measure is in many ways more similar to the Colorado measure, and it has important distinctions that I'll discuss. So like Colorado, it's a two-pronged system. So in that there's a state regulated piece where people can access state regulated medicine through a state licensed system with state licensed facilitators. So that's one prong. And then another piece that Oregon does not have that Colorado has that is another personal use. We call it a personal use system where outside of this regulated system, it also legalizes the personal use of the medicines named in question 4. So the medicines we're talking about here are psilocybin, DMT, mescaline excluding peyote because of its endangered status and its connection to indigenous populations, and ibogaine. And not all of these would be available right at the start under the regulated side. So again, going back to the regulated side, this would allow people to purchase regulated psychedelics to be used only in a licensed location for therapeutic use under the supervision of a state licensed facilitator. So these are facilitators that go through state approved training and meet state approved requirements to get a state license. And then those are the people that will sit with folks using this state regulated medicine. That's the regulated side. On the personal use side, it would allow people 21 and older to possess, cultivate, and share these medicines. They can grow plants in a 12 by 12 foot area with certain restrictions about who, keeping that area, cultivation area away from kids and things like that. And then there's limits. So in some ways it's more restrictive than Colorado because how much you can possess and still have it be considered personal use is actually spelled out in question 4. So there's gram limits on each of these medicines of how much you can possess. So we're not legalizing like a distribution setup or anything like that on the personal use side. And unlike Colorado, there's no clear protection under personal use that someone sitting for you, trip sitting or holding space or guiding or facilitating for you. There's no clear protection that person can get paid on the personal use side. So that's an important nuance from Colorado. And if that passes, we'll see how that plays out. And in some ways, it's more open than Colorado because it doesn't specify which of these medicines will be the first up on the regulated side. In Colorado, we specified that psilocybin was going to be the first one. There are a number of reasons for that, research-based and political, that it would be psilocybin in Colorado. And there's no such restriction or there's no clarity on that point in Massachusetts yet. And like I said, all of these medicines have different benefits and different risks. So it's not clear in Massachusetts which one will be the first one. We are assuming, or many of us think, that it will be psilocybin, but it's not prescribed. The first medicine on the regulated side will be up by 2026, and the others will be up by 2028. And let's see what else I want to say here. the polling is still pretty similar. It's about 50-50 with 14 to 15% undecided. They raised good money early on in Massachusetts for this, but they're running out of money. So if this is something that you care about and you support, now is the time to give and try to support it financially, because those funds will be put to very good use in these last days before the election. Yeah, we hope it will pass. You know, I think it's a very sane measure. I think it's very out. We've seen it. We've seen very similar regulations be implemented in Colorado. Similar measures being implemented in Oregon. It requires a lot of thought and a lot of nuance, but I think we see these other two states doing a good job, and I'm sure Massachusetts would do an excellent job of regulating it. And like I said, people need these medicines. You know, we need to do it safely. We need to do it wisely. But there's really no denying that there's a path of healing that's not available to some individuals in other treatments that we have right now. So that's all I got, Brian.
Thank you, Brina. Yeah, that was wonderful. This is such a fascinating measure. And I should say, I think it's the campaign spokeswoman is so compelling on this. She was the first female Navy SEAL candidate in history, and just speaks about how much veterans like herself would benefit, and really powerful stuff. One question I had, as I understand it, Brina, this is similar to Colorado in that when and if this passes, they will essentially, the state will begin licensing facilitators, for lack of a better word, to kind of help people through the therapy associated with psychedelics. I know Colorado just finished like a long rulemaking hearing about how to appropriately license those folks. Anything jump out to you there? Any sort of issues that were interesting, or where did they land on how many hours of training in this section or that section of I'm just looking into the crystal ball as to what Massachusetts may look like.
It's a great question. For it to be a basic facilitator, like the more, original level of facilitator, it requires 150 hours of didactic coursework, 40 hours of practicum where you're actually sitting with people, but your supervisor is in the room with you, and then another 50 hours of consultation where you're able to work with clients one-on-one, within the confines of the regulations, but then you have to go and consult with supervisors or peer groups about your cases and about how things are going. So it's a pretty heavy training setup. And I think it's like you said, there's been so much conversation and so much sort of chewing on this, and a lot of issues. One of the issues is, how do people who have been helping people with this, at risk to themselves, illegally underground, but still safely, how do we give them credit for the experience that they have? Because oftentimes those are the most skilled facilitators, but they've been operating underground or in a gray market for a very long time. So one of the interesting issues, and same with Indigenous folks, are people who have training in a native tradition that works with these medicines in a highly skilled way, in a way that's been, honed over hundreds of years. So that's been one of the issues. And the way Colorado has dealt with that is they've set up this licensing, sort of basic licensing pathway, but then there are additional accelerated pathways that people can take. So for example, if you're already a licensed practicing psychologist, you can get accelerated and get credit.
Brina, I think you froze.
For 20 years. We're trying to work out how to get credit for that time. So that's what Colorado's trying to do. We haven't seen it implemented yet, but I think they came to a very sort of nuanced view on that.
Gotcha. Well, I really appreciate that. And I will say, if any of the viewers have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Other than that, I'm going to kind of turn things over to our panelists for any sort of final words. I will say, I mean, these campaigns are really close. Like, I'm not the only one losing sleep on the webinar right now about these matters. Hopefully they'll pass. But how can people help? I don't know. Maybe we could start with you, Lauren.
Yes, once I learn how to unmute. Look, listen, these are going to be close, and yes, what's sleep, Brian? Can you remind me of that term? Honestly, right now it is a get out the vote. Visit, as you have here, Smart and Safe Florida. For those of you on social media, we're trying to reach each and every audience, so amplifying any social posts that the campaign is putting out there, because everybody's got a different audience, and so we appreciate the spread of the word. And if anybody's in Florida and wants to door knock or put out signs or volunteer outside of voting precincts. I'll make sure, I don't know if we have contact information on the next page, but we'll make sure that you can get in touch with the campaign.
Yep. I think the viewers should be able to see the websites, and we've also dropped them in
Perfect.
the chat. So yeah, this is the time to get in touch and help out, guys. Matt, do you want to tell us a bit about how folks can participate in the campaigns you discussed?
Well, if you know anyone that lives in those states, call them and then get them to call people that they know. Research has shown that conversation between two people that know each other is the most effective way to shift a person's view on a particular ballot question or candidate. We're inundated constantly with endless mail and TV ads, but two people that know each other can be an uncomfortable conversation, but it's actually the most effective way. So if you've got friends, if you went to school or grew up in one of those states, be an evangelist and turn the people that you know into evangelists, because turnout is everything. And in this day and age, with our political system, I think it's harder and harder for people to see the value of their vote. And so you talking to people back home, if that is your home, or people you know there, and getting them fired up and getting them motivated to call others, that's the one very helpful thing you can do. And the other is donate money, which, it's the least favorite part of my job, but the reality is that ballot initiatives need money to win, and you don't have a person, you don't have a charismatic candidate to go raise that money. You're trying to elect an idea, and ideas can't raise money. So it's always tough to raise money for ballot initiatives, but I can tell you that we could still put those funds to good use. So nobody should think, oh, it's 12 days from the election, they probably got all their plans set in place. No, we can put out a few more mailers. We can boost our Facebook ads with a little more money behind them. So there's still time to make an impact on these campaigns.
Appreciate that, Matt. Matt, you're a charismatic leader to me. We have folks like you and Lauren and Brina fighting the fight, so we appreciate what you're doing. I would say too, MPP.org, where I'm a board member and Matt is the executive director, is a wonderful resource as well. In addition to the state-specific ones. Brina, I'm not sure if you have follow-up thoughts here, but we did have in the chat a member of sort of academia say, how is there a way I can get in touch to educate legislators about psychedelics or cannabis and help create good policy. So I don't know if that's setting on a new approach, or if the campaign themselves is sort of looking for academics to endorse or what have you, but throw that out for you, Brina, if you have any thoughts on the campaign or ways people can help.
Yeah, I mean, I would start by reaching out to this maformentalhealth.org website. You will see a lot of the endorsements and a lot of the research backing it up there. And I think that would probably be the most, assuming you're in Massachusetts, that would be the most coordinated way to participate and have your voice be used in the most efficient way in these last few days. But in general, if you're in another state, if you're in Colorado or Oregon or any other state that hasn't, put this on the ballot for this year, you can definitely just reach out to, there are psychedelics organizations in each of these states. New Approach is a great lobbying firm that really is making a lot of movements and helped a lot of what happened in Colorado and Oregon possible. So they're a great set of people to reach out to. And then each state definitely has, some states more so than others, psychedelic organizations. If you want to just reach out to us and tell us what state you're in, we can give you a list of those, or we can tell you who our allies are in each state.
Thank you, Brina. And one quick question in the chat, and then I did have another sort of follow-up for Matt and Lauren. An individual asked, could you clarify, Brina, if there are requirements for the 150 hours of didactic coursework currently? I don't know if that applies to Colorado or Massachusetts. I think Massachusetts.
Yeah, that must be a Colorado question, because it's in the implementing regulations that all got broken down. Yes, there's very extensive requirements. They need to be completed unless you do one of these accelerated paths. If you're just doing it sort of from scratch, they need to be completed through one of the state approved training programs. I think we have 7 that are approved now, and more are constantly applying to get licensure. And then it's really broken down by hour. So again, you can reach out to us, or you can check on the Natural Medicine Health Act website, and it's really broken down very specifically what each of those 150 hours is.
Thank you, Brina. Matt, this is for you. There's a question in the chat 12 of the last 13 attempts at adult use marijuana legalization have either failed or been overturned by Republican-controlled states. What strategies can these states adopt to ensure success in future ballot measures, especially in light of increasingly bipartisan support for legalization? Thoughts on that one?
The claim is 12 of the last 13 recreational marijuana ballot initiatives have failed. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, that could be not entirely accurate, but I think the broader point is interesting, and you hit upon some of this earlier. It's like basically, you know, there have been shifting tides in terms of these campaigns winning or being implemented, despite public support growing year over year. Thoughts on tactics that I guess can help make these wins meaningful or help move legislators?
Yeah, the 12 out of 13. It's been a rough couple of years. I don't think it's been that bad. Well, I'll just be totally blunt here that the cannabis reform movement is severely underfunded. And with the exception of the Florida campaign, which is great, but for a movement to be successful, it's not just about one ballot initiative and then another ballot initiative. There needs to be infrastructure there, to plan ahead, to assess the best opportunities, to pursue legislative opportunities, to do the legislative work after enactment of a ballot initiative. That's what the Marijuana Policy Project has been for 30 years. We've been at the forefront of coordinating these efforts nationally. And unfortunately, I think we're victims of our own success. And fundraising has become extremely difficult. Philanthropic donors look at MPP and say, why should we keep funding this when there's now a very big industry? Back when you started, there was no industry. We understood you needed money. We, the philanthropists, gave it to MPP. But now, you know, with so many states having legalized and companies with huge valuations, it's been very difficult to convince philanthropists to continue funding it. But sadly, the industry has not filled that gap. And so MPP has gotten a lot smaller, and we're not able to do as much. And I think that, coupled with the fact that, as I noted earlier, we did the low-hanging fruit. We're in tougher terrain, but we're in tougher terrain with far less funding than we had before. And, you know, so whatever shortcomings we're seeing in the cannabis reform movement, it's because we don't have the infrastructure or resources that we used to have, even though arguably we need them just as much as we did before because of the conservative nature of the states that we're now fighting to pass these laws in. So that's not an answer that's going to make anybody here feel good, but it's, in my opinion, the truth.
I appreciate that, Matt. And I do think, I mean, there's a pretty good chance that we could be entering a little bit of a golden age here with, you know, if these states win and then we get rescheduling, which seems likely, and then whoever the new president is seems to be intent on changing law at the federal level. You know, there could be more funding and more interest that comes into this space, certainly, especially with rescheduling and 280E going away. That seems like it would make a lot of businesses more profitable, and they would want to continue to push advocacy work. So we're running up against the clock here. I don't know if any of our panelists have final words, or we can just encourage those folks who tuned in to really get in touch, check out the websites, and help with this final 2-week push here.
I saw one question, a comment regarding a Trump mailer or Trump ads we're doing in South Dakota. And yes, we are touting the fact that former President Trump endorsed the Florida campaign and endorsed legalization as a policy. And I'd want to give credit to the Florida campaign for, I'm sure, playing an important role in getting that position stated by the former president. And we're reminding voters here in South Dakota that Trump is on board with this issue. And wasn't my favorite mailer or digital ad to design, but my job is to win a campaign, and we know that Trump is popular here, and we've got to meet voters where they are.
Thanks, Matt. If there's no final words from the panelists, this has been a wonderful discussion. Please get in touch with those individuals. Here's their contact information, and then we also have the websites for the campaigns. And let's hope we win some things here shortly. Thank you all.
Thank you, Brian, for hosting this and for being such a great ally.
My pleasure, guys.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.